All of this prepares us now for the finale of the symphony, an epic symphony within a symphony that lasts itself a full half hour. There's a long, slow introduction that begins in a most arresting way with a series of events happening in rapid succession. First, a loud pluck in the lower strings, followed by swirling figures in the celesta and the harps, kind of like cosmic dust being thrown up, and a kind of open-ended chord in the winds and strings, on top of which a soaring theme in the violin emerges with an upwards arc and a downward turn, at which point it's cut off by that theme that I mentioned earlier in the first movement, the military tattoo on the drums, on top of which is placed this major minor alternating chord. It comes back a number of times itself in the symphony, as does that whole opening gesture. And it gives way to a theme in the tuba that sounds very strange and spare and lonely. This is the very beginning of the introduction to the last movement. The aura of mystery in this slow introduction continues when Mahler gives us a theme in the horn, which is underpinned by a sort of treading, walking rhythm in the celesta and the winds, and if you listen carefully, the sound of distant church bells. It's another example of the kind of pastoral dream music that we heard in the first and the third movement, but now with the added symbolism of church bells in the distance. So it's as if we're now really at the mountaintop, and the only sound that we hear is down in the village below with the pealing of church bells. Suddenly, the dream becomes a nightmare in the form of a wild outburst in the trumpets and a kind of jagged bouncing rhythm in the rest of the orchestra. The two elements don't belong together, and they leap out of nowhere before eventually settling into a completely different world of basically a chorale, a Lutheran hymn tune. And it reminds me how much of Mahler's music draws on elements of immediately recognizable musical DNA. I've mentioned hymn tunes, I've mentioned marches, folk song. All of these elements that Mahler drew on are on a primal level recognizable to us. They're just woven into a very complex and ever-changing musical fabric. So here, at the end of this excerpt, we hear, as I mentioned, a chorale, like a hymn tune in the low winds. And this is something that comes back a number of times later in the movement. Well, eventually, Mahler starts to build some energy and speed into the process and transitions us into the main body of the movement at a faster tempo of allegro. In this section, we get the feeling that he's sort of drawing on kind of like summoning elements of an army together for an assault, and it spills over into the main part of the movement, as I say, the allegro, which has some reminiscence of the opening grimness of the march of the first movement in it. Clearly, if you're painting on such a large canvas, you have to introduce the element of contrast to sustain interest. And at this point, Mahler gives us a different kind of world, a second theme, if you like, in the allegro. It still goes fast, but it's now in the major and it's more buoyant. It's actually a variant of one of the horn themes that we heard way back in the introduction. But now it bounces along in a cheerful manner and gives way to a wonderful, passionate outburst in the strings, a kind of theme that just envelops you in its arms and gives you a great, generous bear hug. So we're now in the vast central section of the movement that's called the development, the part where Mahler develops a lot of the material that we've heard up until this point and varies and contrasts it. And it's as I say, it's a vast and in some ways unwieldy section. It lasts a long time, but in a couple of places it's marked by an unmistakable sound that I want to talk about. It's like a road marker, architecturally speaking. But it's the first time we hear it, it's as a result of a climax. The orchestra builds in a crescendo, and we get the sense that something big is about to happen. And what happens is that Mahler introduces something that had never happened in an orchestra before, a part technically of the percussion section. And it's called a hammer. And what Mahler asks for in the score is some sort of device, and everybody has different ways of doing it, which calls for the player to raise and then lower basically a big wooden hammer onto some sort of wooden platform or resonating surface, the resulting effect being basically an axe blow, but not a metallic character. He wants something that's very wooden and dull sounding. It's kind of like a bomb going off, basically. And if we do our job right, it will feel like it's hit you in the solar plexus. And what that hammer blow does is unleash a torrent of sound. It's like a nuclear bomb going off, and it unleashes this incredible torrent of wild and frenzied energy. It's like the four horsemen of the apocalypse have suddenly come across the scene. And it's terrifying music. This is how it's all set up. Well, clearly you can only sustain that kind of wild energy for so long. And at a certain point, Mahler dissolves things and brings us an extended march section. It really goes on for quite a while. And I get the sense of watching this, I get a visual image of a whole cast of characters parading before us, of all different kinds of personalities and types, but they're all marching in the same rhythm together. So it's a kind of parade of sorts. After that, Mahler builds up the tension again and sort of ratchets things up, and we get the sense that things are building to boiling point, and as indeed they do, and the hammer comes back for a second appearance and unleashes a torrent of energy, if it's possible, even wilder and more out of control than the first time. It's pretty scary stuff, but it has an incredibly gripping power on our imagination. Then we have a return once more of the swirling cloud figures of cosmic dust in the celeste, and that violin figure, and the major minor chord, and the dream world of the introduction. All of this comes back a second time. So the question inevitably arises at this point, where is this music going? We've been on this huge journey within a journey. Mahler has taken us to all sorts of emotional states. But where is it ultimately going? Mahler starts to build a big climax. It's introduced by a beautifully spiritually uplifting theme that we've heard earlier. And all the indications Mahler gives us is that this is going to turn from tragedy into triumph, much the way that his First and Fifth Symphony did. A journey from darkness into light. We see the intensity of the light building in the development of this music at this point. And it seems like it really is headed towards an affirmatory conclusion. It's going to be a happy ending. We just have the feeling in our bones. So when Mahler cuts things off with one more return of the swirling cloud dust music and another return of that major minor chord with the military tattoo underneath. It's such a shock because it's just not where we expect it to go. And it feels like we've been denied. At the moment where we expected the greatest triumph, Mahler pulls the rug out from underneath our feet, brings back this chaotic introductory chord, and plunges us into the deep recesses of the coda, the last part of this movement, which is a moving funeral lament given to 4 trombones and tuba that just unfolds sorrowfully and with infinite regret. The whole succession of these events is extraordinarily powerful. I'm going to play it for you right now, but in context of the whole symphony, it's infinitely more powerful. So at the very end of this journey, the music has taken us down to a single note. The trombones eventually dissolve their sound into the basses and bass clarinet, and we're left with a single solitary note in the basses, just held for what seems like a long, long time, and lulling us into thinking that that's how the symphony is going to end, and just fade to black. But Mahler has one more stroke of genius awaiting us, and that is a final executioner's blow, if you like, or the guillotine coming down, or the curtain coming down. You can choose your own image, but it comes in the form of a short and incredibly loud chord on the full orchestra, which probably will make you jump out of your skin if we're doing our job right. It comes out of nowhere, and it's the final death knell for the symphony as we hear that last tattoo on the timpani retreat into nothing. Trumpets are holding a minor chord, and then the last word is given to the strings, who with just a single pluck of the strings, pizzicato, bring the symphony to its desolate and powerful close. So there you have it, a powerful end to a powerful symphony by a composer at the height of his creative powers. I hope that everything you've heard up until this point has been a useful roadmap for you to navigate the journey that we're all going to take on August 7th. And I hope it might have even piqued your interest into exploring the entire symphony by way of either YouTube clips or CD or iTunes. There are many ways of approaching this music. Nonetheless, I hope that you will join the orchestra and me on stage at 6:30 on August 7th for what promises to be a very special and moving journey. Thank you.